Hello there, I'm Fairclough, a.k.a. EvilBoris. I'm not a professional display calibrator or TV reviewer. I am, however, a gamer and an HDR enthusiast, and today we're going to be taking a look at the HDR of Fallout 76. Fallout 76 was released and a number of you have asked me to take a look at the game. First up, let's go take a look at the HDR brightness setup and controls in the display settings. Oh. Fallout 76 does not have any adjustments that can be made. This is super unusual. Could it be that Bethesda game studios have expertly crafted and mastered the game to function really well for every single display type, capability and user setup, all without transmitting any metadata to the display? No, they have not. The HDR of Fallout 76 appears to be a straight conversion from the SDR version of the game's output. The usual telltale signs of this are lots of non-recoverable white clipping, which we see on lights in interiors, the sun and other VFX such as these lasers and fire that you see throughout the game. When we pass the HDR footage through my luminance heat map filter, we can see that anything that was pure white in SDR is now being pushed up to a maximum of 600 nits. We won't be spending much time looking at the game with the luminance filter on, as it just doesn't really tell us much about the image due to it being derived from SDR. This 600 nit peak is suspiciously close to the values that we've seen in other SDR to HDR conversions, such as Nier Automata and Red Dead Redemption 2. It's also very close to the highest values I've seen in the underwhelming HDR of Spider-Man. Coincidence? To show just how straightforward this conversion is, I performed the same conversion manually in Photoshop. A simple level adjustment is all it takes to move the HDR output to look very close to the game's output in SDR. Just bear in mind this is actually a different location and there's some slight differences in the scene lighting. The problem yet again with this is that we've seen the same problem some of these other titles suffer from: raised blacks. When running in HDR, the darkest any pixel value could get to was a grey 3 nits, whereas over in SDR, black is black. So blacks become grey and the overall contrast is reduced. With this reduction in contrast also comes another byproduct: a reduction in colour saturation. These things aren't entirely evident all the time when you play Fallout 76, as it's actually pretty colourful compared to, say, Red Dead Redemption 2, so the reduction in saturation isn't quite as detectable until you disable HDR and look at the game running in SDR. Games themselves are often internally being rendered in HDR and then toned up down to operate within the dynamic range for standard display. This tone map output being what we ultimately see. With the advent of HDR-capable displays, developers now have the option to not tone map their games down quite as drastically and actually target HDR-capable displays. Given the amount of clipping on show, there could have been a possibility that these aspects of the rendering engine just weren't actually HDR. However, the game itself gave itself away. Passing behind this tinted material reduced the luminosity, and this reveals the otherwise clipped out white of these lights. This is something that couldn't be replicated external to the engine, either from the console or the display. And this confirms that the engine is at least part functioning in HDR. So with this in mind, what are the advantages of doing this SDR expansion? None as far as I can tell. So even if we weren't raising the blacks and stretching the image to fit correctly within ST2084, this overall elevation in luminance and APL, average picture level, will just cause a lot of displays to reach their physical hardware luminance limitations or force ABL, automatic brightness limiting, to kick in, resulting in an image that is likely going to be not a great deal different from what SDR would have offered in the first place, luminance-wise. We get a bunch of negatives and not really any positives. As well as these degradations to black level, contrast and saturation, all of which you could possibly ignore or defeat at least partially with display adjustments, we have another problem that appears when in HDR mode. This super egregious banding and posterization occurs in the skybox and in other atmospheric effects. I've tweaked the colour a little bit on one side of the screen here to better highlight this issue to you, as I'm unsure as just how well it will show up in YouTube. In SDR, this issue is almost totally eliminated by comparison. This suggests that all of the conversion from SDR to HDR, both from a luminance value, gamma correction, and colour space expansion, is all happening as a post-render set of calculations. The 8-bit output simply doesn't have enough data to make the sheer amount of adjustments and contortions to move from 8-bit gamma to 10-bit PQ 2084 losslessly. Hopefully with time, Bethesda will go back and make the necessary changes to the back end and move the game to having a full native HDR output, fixing the black levels, the white clipping and that awful banding. With these problems in mind, our recommendation is to play this without HDR enabled. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Fallout 76. If you have any other suggestions for games you'd like me to deep dive into, just tell me in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and come follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks again.